This project is funded by the Area of Advanced Transport at Chalmers. Our departing hypothesis was that the innovations in the logistics system that have enabled e-commerce and the on-demand economy tend to benefit a privileged sector of the society, and at the same time, it tends to marginalize vulnerable sectors of society. Ultimately, what we want to do in this project is, first, to identify what are the factors that are the origin of this marginalization. Second, to unveil the initiatives that have led to a more sustainable or more access to goods. And third, to identify elements so that we can design the logistics systems of the future where we have a more equitable access to goods. Many logistics service innovations are aimed at increasing the quality of life in our cities. But these urban logistics innovations, of course, follow a business logic. And this had led to the fact that most of these innovations are serving a segment of the population that is young, has a good education level, has high income, and tend to live in very central areas of cities. Interesting, but also sadly, these advances in logistics services have increased even further the inequalities in our society. Segments of the population that were already segregated and that did not have good access to goods ended up being also marginalized from these innovations. There are different reasons for that. It could be either because they don't have the knowledge to access those services, they do not have knowledge how to get to internet, or they don't have access to internet, or they just simply don't have the skills. It could be also because of location. So it may be that they live in rural areas or suburban areas where there's not a good access for vehicles. Or it could be also because of lack of integration into the system. For instance, refugees or immigrants, they may not have a social security number for some time, and that prevents them from having a bank ID, which is necessary to access many of those services. In this project, what we want to do is to answer two questions. The first question is, who is benefiting from these innovations in logistics? And the second one is, how do we redesign these logistics services so that we can have a more equitable transport system? This is important because we have seen more and more people living in cities. This has meant that we have also seen an increase in e-commerce, and during the pandemic, this trend even accelerated. And we're expecting the increase in e-commerce to be continued over time. What this means is that there will be a reshape of the retail industry. Accessibility is mostly studied from a passenger transportation perspective, but this is also valid for goods. Today, it's not sufficient to study and understand how to provide the means of transport for people to get access to shops and to goods, but it's also crucial to understand how can we design a system where goods can be delivered to everyone's homes. The pandemic was a great way to illustrate the importance of this project. By coincidence, we started our project in March 2020 when the pandemic started. So the first study that we did was to assess how marginalization from home deliveries became a pressing issue for vulnerable populations that were living in areas with high COVID rates and with very low access to home deliveries. We already conducted some interviews and we collected some data that show us that there is a gap between different areas and between population segments. We did a study in Västra Götaland region, and we found out that during the pandemic, 50% of the postcodes did not have good access to home deliveries. What is more relevant is that 10% of the older population, which was more vulnerable to COVID-19, lived in areas where access to home deliveries was quite low. Society identified this issue, and actually people started to organize themselves so that they could provide goods to those vulnerable populations. Also, last mile providers started to develop new services and expand the scope of their deliveries. The pandemic helped to close that gap. We saw that by the end of the third wave, pharmacies were serving almost every postcode in the Västra Götaland region with home deliveries. Some e-grocers also followed that trend and served almost 80% of all postcodes in the Västra Götaland area. We don't know if that's going to remain over time, but that was something positive that came out of the pandemic. We are using the service inclusion concept in order to develop recommendations for closing this gap. The idea is that we are able to embed the concept of social sustainability into the urban logistics system of the future. We have already initiated the discussion around how to have equitable access to goods. We hope that these results will highlight the gap that exists in logistics service provision, and we can even trigger the entrance of new actors that could fill the market gap for inclusive services. We basically want to show that designing inclusive logistics systems should not be only a matter of times of crisis like the pandemic, but it should be the norm for a truly sustainable transport system if we want to reach a sustainable and equitable society.